Alright, welcome back to another web development video where I show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video I'm going to show you how to make this Mosaic grid using CSS Grid, and it's going to have this nice little hover effect over the top of it. And key to this grid is getting a featured image. So we can actually tag any of our images as featured, and the rest of the content is going to flow around it. So this is about as good as we can do with the Mosaic grid as far as CSS Grid is concerned right now. We can't do a true masonry layout or anything like that without using some JavaScript, but we can create a nice static grid like this, and we could actually make it dynamic by adding more images or posts or whatever they are, and then inserting those through JavaScript, or using JavaScript into the HTML, and then tagging each of the large images as featured or not featured, or you could use, if you're using WordPress, you could use the featured category or tag or something like that if you wanted to do that. So let's take a look at it. This is what we have so far. We don't have anything, and we're going to build out our grid first. So just going to have a general grid container. This is going to be what we call our CSS grid on, and then we're just going to have a bunch of grid items. So I'm just going to add maybe 12. And we'll see how that does for us. 10 might be better. Let's start with 10. Alright, and then now we need to put something into our grid item. I like to use, for photographs, I like to use source.unsplash.com. It's like a low-level API for the Unsplash photographs, where you can grab all sorts of photos in different ways. So you can get them from collections if you're familiar with them, or you can get them from maybe ones that you've liked or another user likes. I like to use this one here that allows you to search by keyword, and then it just pulls up a photo by these keywords that you use. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in, and we're going to put an image with a source, and then we just put that URL in as a source, and you see that we get an image pulled in from unsplash.com. Now it's pulling just random. It's like you went to unsplash.com and pulled in a keyword search, and it's just giving you the first one back for that. So let's go ahead and add this in to all of our grid items. I'm just holding down Control and clicking on a PC. That allows me to do multiple lines of code at the same time if you're doing the same thing over and over. This one we're just going to do nature. This one we'll just do water. Those are two easy ones. Let's do man, woman, city, and this could be any keywords that you want. Mountains, blue, pink, dog, and let's say book. So now we have all of our images here. They're showing up, and what we need to do is, you can see that these images are spilling out over the edge of the viewport, and I want to contain those into the viewport. You can see that these images are all 1600 by 900. You can change these dimensions to be like 800 by 800, and it would give you a smaller file size. You can see. I'm going to leave the dimensions as they are. It would help us maybe if we created them in different dimensions, but I wanted to try to show you how to get around some things. So if we made them perfectly square, this would make our it would make our grid much better and easier to control. But I want to show you how we can use something called object fit, which is a newish CSS property, in order to do kind of the same things that we do with the background image, but with an actual image element. So we have all of our items. Let's pull up our CSS, and we're just going to say all of our images we want to be width of 100%, and I want them to be display block, so that gets rid of that little space there you can see. All images have this little space underneath in between them, but if you do display block on the image element itself, it'll get rid of that little space at the bottom of the image. I also want to, I know that Codepen puts a margin of a little bit on the body, so I just want to remove that before we get into anything. So we have responsive images that are going to show up one after another, and we need to go ahead and set our grid. So let's do that. We come to .grid, and this is the class for our grid. And first I want to set it up as a display grid. And then once we have our grid declared, then we can tell it how many columns and how many rows. So I'm going to say grid template columns. I'm just going to use the repeat function because I want these columns to all be the same. So I'm going to say repeat 4 columns. Let's do 4 columns and 1 FR. Okay, so you'll notice that we have a little bit of space here. We're actually going to take in that space. So 4 columns doesn't seem to be right because we have 10 elements. So 4 times 2 is 8, and it seems like you would divide 10 by 5. But that's not what we're going to do, because if we divided by 5, then that would give us 5 and 5, and it would give us a nice even grid. But what we're going to do is we're going to take up more space, so we kind of need that empty space in order to take it up. So you'll see how it works out in just a minute. For right now, let's do no grid gap, no grid. Actually, let's do grid rows, grid template rows, and we're going to say repeat the same 4, I think is what we're going to need, and we'll just do them at like 300 pixels tall. Okay, so we have our so this is grid row 1, 2, 3, and then there's a grid row here that you can't see because there's nothing in it yet. But we're actually going to span a few of these rows. So you're going to see that we're going to actually have this will all be taken up in just a moment. And so what we need to do now is we need to create our featured items. So we're just going to label a few of these to be featured. And it doesn't do anything now because we haven't attached any styles to that particular class. So let's just go down here and we'll create our featured class. And we want our featured image to be 2 columns by 2 rows. So we want it to take up 2 columns and 2 rows instead of 1 column and 1 row. So the way that we do that is we say grid column, singular, not with an S, and then we're just going to say span 2. So it allows these featured images to span across 2. If you're familiar with doing CSS tables, or this is in Flexbox 2, I think you can do, where you can span across elements. So you're going across 2 rows, so you can see there are 2 columns. So you see there's 1 column, and this is a column, and this is spanning across 2 of those columns, and then you have the other 2 columns here. And then we also want it to span 2 rows. So right now this is all in row 1, row 2, row 3, and row 4. So we want it to say grid row span 2. And so now we have our image that's going 2 columns wide, and it's also going 1 row, 2 rows. And then here's row 3. I think that's right. We're creating some implicit rows here because we're pushing everything down. Everything is sort of relatively positioned, and so it's pushing everything around. That is definitely not the look that we're going for, although it's not completely unpleasant. If you added maybe a third class that was medium class or something like that and made some of these images a little bit, so you had a small, a medium, and a large image. So if you did something like that, maybe the grid would work out okay. It's not exactly what we're going for. So the way that we control the density of all of the elements inside of our grid is that we come up here and we use the grid dash auto dash flow. We use that property, and the value that we put in here is going to determine how our rows and everything automatically flow around each other. And I'm going to use what's called the dense, if I can spell it. I'm going to use dense, and what dense does is it flows everything back in around. So you see it's kind of pulled things up into it a little bit. Let's see. I've gone wrong up in here. Let's see. Okay. So you can see now, because I declared the rows to be a certain height, it sort of messed everything up a little bit. But now everything is just kind of automatically flowing from one row to the next. And you can see that we have our featured images, and this is a featured image, and then everything else is sort of flowing around it. Now our featured, this featured image is number 1, which makes sense. And then we have grid item 2, 3, 4, and then the 5th one is this element here, but you can see that they're sort of next to each other, but it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I believe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So if we take off the dense, you can see how it does not flow. So we have grid item number 1, 2, 3, 4, and then because grid item 5 is too big for this space, it gets pushed down to another line, and then becomes 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and because there's no space over here, it pushes it down another row again, so 10. And if I were to go through and number each of these, you would see the numbers for each of them and how everything flows. Let's just go ahead and do that. What's the best way to do this? We're going to need to put an overlay anyway. So let's go ahead and do that now. So again, just holding down Control and clicking allows me to manipulate multiple elements all at once in the HTML. You can use this on most code editors, allow you to do that. We're just going to create a class of overlay, and then for each of our overlays we're going to just put a number. Okay. So you can see for each of our images how everything is being laid out. So this is image number 1. That's exactly what we thought. It's a featured image. And then it goes up. And so all of these images are only going to be on one row. So number 1, 2, 3, 4. And then because this number 5 right here is featured, it doesn't fit into this space. So what grid does is it automatically pushes it down to the next row, and then continues laying out the grid. So 6, 7, 8, 9, and because there's no space here, it goes down and creates a new row and just pushes everything down the space a little bit. Okay, so we can see that. Let's go ahead and do manipulate our overlay. Let's turn our dents back on. So when we turn dents back on, let's see everything. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gets pushed down to a new line, a new row, because it doesn't fit here. But instead of leaving a gap, when we use the dents autoflow, what it does is it takes the next available element, which is number 6, and instead of placing 6 right here, which is what it did before, so you can see the mountains are here, it takes this and it moves it up to fill in the next space, and then 7 will move here, 8, 9, and then 10 will fill in down here and give us a nice complete grid. We're getting some weird wonky space because of these numbers, but we'll take care of that in just a minute. So you can see how it lays it out. So if you don't care about source order, because it's going to take everything out of the source order that you have in the HTML, so if that is of no consequence to you, which it's not for us in this particular example, then you can just lay them out and create these new featured images. In fact, if we wanted to just put this onto a different item, you can see now that it's laid out number 6 as the featured image. See that? If we wanted to come in and lay out an even different one, we can do that as well. And now you can see, so it's gone 1, 2, 3 doesn't fit here, so it pushes 3 down to another row. This is row number 2, and it doesn't fit over here because this one is pushing it over, and then it backfills. Instead of 4 being somewhere over here, it pushes it up even 2 rows up, and then it starts filling in 5, 6, and then it can't go any farther, so it goes down to another row, 7, 8, 9, 10. So you can see how you can create just sort of a little mosaic effect just by adding this one little class where you span across 2. You could even push it to span across 3 like this, and so now your images is spanning 3 columns and 3 rows. You see how that is. You could span 1 column and 3 rows, which doesn't look very good. And here it's spanning 2 columns, but it's not taking up the whole thing because of the size of the image, which we'll deal with in just a minute. So let's go back to our original 2x2 featured image, and then let's deal with our overlay very quickly. And what we want to do is we want to say the overlay is position absolute, because we want it to be on top of the image itself. So we positioned it inside of our grid item, so it should be over top of the image itself. And you'll see that's how we're going to create the hover effect in just a moment. And then we want it to be top 0, good, just to declare these numbers, and have a width of 100% and a height of 100%. And because this overlay is position absolute, we need to go ahead and declare this grid item. So whatever the parent container is that we want it to be contained within, we want to make sure that we have that item specifically declared to be position relative, because it's absolutely positioned based on some sort of container, and it's going out to the largest container. You can see here that it's got number 10 up here, but all the numbers are being stacked on top of each other because they're not being contained relative to their closest container. So the way that we do that is we say the grid item is position relative, and then it'll evenly disperse our numbers out. So now each of these grid items is explicitly position relative, and then this number, this overlay, is absolutely positioned to the top 0 and the left 0, the top left hand corner of this relatively positioned element. So absolute positioning is a little bit strange, but it's really powerful if you can understand how you can move things around the container. Because if we say right 0, then now this is going to work. Top right. Okay, you have to do the text align to the right. It was because of this. So now we can absolutely position it to the top and the right, or you could do the bottom and the right, and it will take away the height, and it will absolutely position our element to the bottom and to the right. Okay. Alright, so that's how absolute positioning works. It has to be declared inside of whatever the closest container is, or whatever the container you want it to be contained by. So these numbers relate to this container right here. So if we wanted it to be related to the body, then we would just make the body explicitly position relative, and then it will put all of our numbers wherever we wanted them to go. So let's backtrack on some of this a little bit. Okay. And so now we have our numbers, our overlay, and our overlay you can see is in the top left. It's positioned 100% of this element wide and 100% of the height of each container, each grid item, which is exactly where we want them to be. I'm going to remove the numbers because they have served their purpose in order to show source order and how that order gets messed up whenever we use a grid autoflow. Okay, so we take those numbers off. We no longer have the numbers. We're pretty close to where we want to be as far as our grid is concerned. You can see that our grid is relatively responsive. It's not as responsive maybe as we want it to be, so we can manipulate that a little bit by just changing our rows and columns. And then let's go ahead, before we do that, before we work on the responsiveness of it, let's work on this overlay. Now I had shown you before, pull that in here, I had showed you before how you can hover over it and you can see that there's a little overlay on it, kind of a darkening of each image, and then when you hover it removes that darkening so you can see the full image. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to create this overlay is going to be sort of an overlay over top of the image, which will darken the image, and using RGBA colors we can actually manipulate that, because then we have an alpha channel that controls transparency. So just like you would use in Photoshop or Illustrator, where you manipulate the alpha channel for transparency, we can do that on the web, at least a little bit. So for our overlay, we want to set the background. If we just do something like a black, then it makes everything 100% black over the top of it. But if we were to set it to RGBA and then 0. Let's say 5. Now it adds an overlay, a background overlay over each of these overlay elements, and we have the element put on each of these. If we remove it or comment it out, you can see that one of these doesn't have it. So the last grid item, it doesn't have the overlay on it, so you see it fully 100%, right? So let's put that back on, and so now all of our elements have an overlay, a background overlay. And what we want is when we hover over the element, we want it to go away. We want it to change. So normally we might come down, I'm using SAS here, and we would say overlay with the pseudo class of hover. And then we might think, oh, well, let's just take this background and then we'll make it fully transparent. And that does work a little bit. It works, but what it does is it jumps. So normally in order to make that a smoother transition, we would say this. We would say transition, background, like 400 milliseconds, ease in, ease out, which actually works really well. So you can see that that's not a bad way to go. I had used a linear gradient before, but this is another way of doing it. I'll show you another way. So a lot of times I like to use what's called a linear gradient for backgrounds, and then you do that. So you kind of have a starting point for your gradient and you have an ending point for your gradient, and then use that as the background for the overlay. So we would say 0.5, and then you can see if I'm using some sort of filter or a background gradient, that it just jumps, because what it's doing is it's completely changing. It's like changing the image. It just it doesn't smoothly move or transition from one image to another. It just kind of jumps and creates a whole new linear gradient here. That's how it's been explained to me, and no amount of transitioning is able to deal with that. So for instance, if you were doing let's just do something else here. Instead of that, let's use a filter. So background, let's say filter, a blur of 3 pixels. Will that work? That's not going to work. Alright, well, I didn't plan on showing you that. I planned on just showing you how to get around this particular situation if you're using something like a gradient over the top of these things. So let's say you wanted the top to be 3 and you wanted the bottom to be like 9. You can see that you get a nice gradient from the top to the bottom of each image. It's even more pronounced if you do something like 2. So maybe you had some text down here, and what you wanted was to be able to hover over the image and maybe get rid of the text or something like that. But you wanted to be able to display that text at the bottom more easily, regardless of what the image is or you know, what colors or anything are in the image. You can put a little gradient over it and it'll show down at the bottom, and then when you hover over it, it'll get rid of the gradient altogether. But we get this kind of jumpy effect and we wanted something a little bit more smooth. So the thing that we have to do is we need to come into not transitioning this, but what we need to do is we need to transition opacity. So we can have our background, but on hover we're not changing the linear gradient. What we want to change is the opacity of this overlay over the top of the image. So opacity is something that can be transitioned or animated, but a linear gradient on the background cannot be transitioned. So linear gradient here, and then opacity here, and then we're not transitioning the background element, we're transitioning the opacity 400 milliseconds in ease. And then now you can see that even with a background linear gradient over it, or if you did a radial gradient or whatever you're doing as your filter, you can actually do that by, we're just essentially saying when I hover over the overlay, make the opacity 0, so make it just go away. It's still sitting on top of the image, but we're seeing completely through it. So that's how you can use filters, and you can use some of these more advanced values for your background and still be able to transition and create a nice transition effect without having to use any sort of JavaScript or anything like that. And then, like I showed you before, the easier way would just be to transition a background. If you don't need the linear gradient, then the easier way would just be to transition this as a background color. So we just take our RGBA color, we set it as the background, let's say, I don't know, 0.6, and then we transition this background. Instead of opacity, we transition it to 0. So then we have it, you can see that you get the same effect, and then when you want it to transition it, you just say background 400 milliseconds ease, and we get the same thing. But you'll notice that we don't get the nice gradation. It's just showing you one solid color over the background, which is a pretty common pattern. But if you're looking for this linear gradient pattern, this is how you would do it. And if you just need one solid color all across the background, and this, you can just transition that background color just like that. You could also add, you know, background dash color, and you could transition background dash color as well. All right, so this let's work on the responsiveness. So it looks pretty cool, you know, at a large size like this. And as we get down to, let's say 768 is a normal size for like an iPad sort of device. Let's go ahead and transition this. And what we're going to do is we're just going to copy this and create a new media query. So at media, and then the minimum width is 768 pixels. Then we want to do this 4-column grid. So I'm just going to get rid of that because I want to keep the other things at the lower level. And I want to keep this as 4 columns. But what if we made this into 2 columns at a lower size? So as we transition lower than 7, so at the minimum width, when you get to 768, we should make it 4 columns. And then below 768, we should make it 2 columns, or, you know, what does 3 look like? So 3 still gives us kind of a funky grid. I like the 2 columns personally, so you can really highlight some of your images, especially the featured images are really going to be highlighted there. And let's set another breakpoint. So we'll just copy that, because at smaller on smaller devices, you can see this starts to get pretty small down here. So let's say at 500 pixels, 450 pixels. Then we're going to take this. Let's just copy this. It'll be easier, because that's really the only thing we're transitioning here is the columns. So we make this 2, and then down here you can make this 1, or you can just say at this point 1 FR, and then it makes everything take up its own column. You see that? So each of these grid items is only taking up 1 column of space. And then as we get up to, see down there, 450 pixels, then it goes into this nice little grid. Again, if we take off the dents, we'll see that there are gaps that are being left open, right? So we got to keep that dents on there from the very beginning. That way it fills in all of our grid. Technically, I suppose you could wait. You could wait until later, but we'll just leave that on there for now. And so you get a nice responsive grid as you move up. And if you know that you're going to have touch devices at a small size, you could even take this media query here, actually this one, and then we could set our overlay into a media query where that only shows when you get to the larger sizes. So when you get down here, there's no overlay, because essentially what you're doing is on a touch screen device, you're going to have to touch each one in order to see the full image. So you don't get the same effect as you do with the hover whenever you hover a mouse over it. So if you wanted to set that in, you can even set that in as like a, I don't know, like 1000 pixels or more, because that's essentially where people are going to be with a device that has a mouse in it, where you can hover over it and see that effect. And then everything under that, you're just going to be able to see the image itself, because you just don't really need that hover effect, because it's going to be in essence a touch effect. So, alright, so that is a Mosaic grid using CSS Grid and having sort of a hover effect over the images. Didn't mean to do that, but it's going to redisplay everything here. So it shows our grid with the hover on it. So pretty cool little effect. And like I said, you could dynamically generate these elements and insert them into the CSS or into the HTML. And then as you go through, all you have to do is tag each of these elements as featured, or if you had some sort of CMS that allowed you to create categories and you could put it into a featured category, then you can tap into that featured class that it puts on, that the CMS puts on it, and then as you tag your post as featured, it would show the featured image where it's larger, like this. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Hopefully I went slow enough. If you're new to CSS Grid, I also have a kind of an intro to CSS Grid playlist. So if you have any questions, though, leave them down in the comment section below. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. My goal is that it's so clear that nobody has any questions, and I hope that this is something that provides value to you as you begin to use CSS Grid in the real world, not only for just common grid layout sorts of things, but more advanced designs like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.